What do an oil shock in the Gulf, Netflix streaming the Yankees Giants on opening night, the explosive rise of microdramas, and a surprisingly strong showing from digital newspapers have in common? Well, they all point to the same thing. The advertising market is being reshaped in real time and not always in the ways you'd expect. This week, we're breaking down why global ad growth may be a little bit more resilient than the macro headlines suggest, even as the Iran conflict rattles energy, shipping, and consumer confidence. We'll look at what Netflix's move into baseball, live baseball, says about the next phase of premium ad-supported streaming, and we'll unpack why microdramas are suddenly becoming a serious force across EMEA and the US, turning short-form storytelling into a new battleground for attention. We'll also get into the latest US ad revenue outlook, where digital continues to power growth and digital newspapers quietly outperforming expectations, finally looking a bit more like a modern media business than a legacy one. You're listening to the Media Intelligence podcast from WPP Media. I'm Kate Scott-Dawkins with Jeff Foster and Nidhi Shah from the Business Intelligence team, and each week we unpack the biggest stories in media and marketing and why they matter for brands. So let's start with the piece that I think is top of everyone's news feeds at the moment. We're looking at what the Iran conflict and the disruption around the Strait of Hormuz could mean for global advertising. Any initial feedback on headlines or what you're hearing in market around the dinner table or the office in terms of how closely people are following this, I guess, outside of news hounds like us? Because I think I'm just constantly plugged into news 24/7.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit towards the US part, personally what I'm kind of seeing around the office. I would say it's definitely top of mind, but not I would say people are conscious and aware of it, but it doesn't seem to really be filtering down into like any tangible effects or anything that I've seen or heard of yet. I think it's one of these things that people are just sort of keeping an eye on like we are. But I would say from personally, definitely monitoring it a lot closer than what I think, some other people may be, just to sort of see an eye on the impacts. And, just as we were talking about in our other discussions, this sort of the secondary shocks that may take a while to sort of, rear its head throughout the marketplace.
Nidhi, anything you want to add from a European perspective?
Yeah, I mean, just being in the UK is similar, really. There's a mixture of feelings, and it's hard as an analyst, right? Like you have to stick to the facts, but also there is a lot of conversation you're also part of. So, people worried about fuel prices, that rocketing up quite significantly. But at the same time, I've been in talking to friends and family who also mention about, some of these second order impacts maybe impacting food and whether we're at a point where we need to stock up, depending on how this plays. I think overall, just looking at even the OECD GDP forecasts this week for the UK in particular, I know there was big headlines on GDP growth being cut, but that's still in line with a lot of the European counterparts, and that GDP growth still growing for this year. There could be inflation impacts, but still, the Bank of England last week held their rate steady as well, and also mentioning about these waiting for that greater clarity, which is not so clear yet.
Yeah, so similar. I mean, if anyone wants a sort of wonky policy-minded read, I listened to a great podcast from the Foreign Affairs interview talking about primarily European-US relations. It was really good. We wrote our own analysis that is really focused, obviously, on the advertising market and how this may impact our forecasts and our growth projections for the next year, the next 5 years, really. So the key takeaway from our analysis is pretty straightforward. I mean, this is a major macro shock, but there are reasons why advertising growth in particular may prove a bit more resilient than the headlines suggest. That said, and one of the other key messages is that pressure from these shocks, again, like you said, not only oil, but fertilizer, food, second order, travel, jet fuel, all of that's going to be very unevenly felt. And so that's a big focus for marketers, obviously, is which sector do they sit in, which market do they sit in, which consumers are they trying to reach, and how is this going to impact all of those different groups separately. So it's certainly not just an oil story. There's a huge amount of fertilizer, for instance, that comes through that strait as well, which as we're getting into the growing season season for Northern Hemisphere potentially has significant impacts on food prices as we go, not just this year, but then the following year as well. And so trying to forecast in all those various impacts and how long it takes things to get restarted as well is quite an interesting thing. So we may carry through kind of okay in this first year, and then next year we see a dip, for instance, as you have impacts to, say, crops that were growing this year and are only being harvested into next year. So it's a really, really interesting sort of dynamic to try and monitor and parse for clients. I think this moment is maybe a little bit different from past shocks. It's important to keep that in mind. The ad economy has some structural support underneath it that we think is creating a bit of a floor for advertising, such that even a big macroeconomic shock may not be able to completely disrupt the growth that we were anticipating. So you have, for instance, a lot of spending is concentrated in very large global platforms, which makes the overall market more stable at the top level. And then you have the current growth in AI spending acting as, again, that floor under demand, creating new advertisers, improving efficiency of existing advertisers, encouraging companies to stay aggressive, even in uncertain conditions. When we talk about things like creative destruction and the ability for new companies to come in and disrupt old ones, I think the rate of change that could happen there is even greater with the advent of AI. And that's one of the things that I think didn't necessarily exist to the same extent in past shocks, where advertisers maybe could pull back or do a wait and see. And now I think the potential threat of competition is so great that the price of inaction or pulling back is potentially even greater than it has been in the past. So the overall market might slow. I forgot to say, we also have, e-commerce as a major driver, right? So Asia-based e-commerce brands, digital commerce in general, I think continuing to support growth in a lot of international markets and will continue to do so, we think, especially as long as domestic demand, particularly in China, remains quite sluggish. Those companies are going to be looking for growth in every market around the world and spending behind that. So yes, the overall ad market may slow. We're talking about maybe a percentage points or basis points hit to our overall ad growth for the next couple of years. Again, clients saw those, revised projected forecasts in a note to them, but the current view is that it doesn't go into decline next year, at least in a bull or base case scenario. So let's talk about those. We do lay out in the analysis we send to clients 3 potential scenarios, right? Bull, base, and bear. At a high level, even across those 3, the basic premise is that if we see disruption ease relatively quickly, say sometime in April, advertising growth probably stays pretty close to its previous path, right? And that we've already seen pretty good growth through Q1 before we really got to the brunt of this conflict, and things recover relatively quickly. If it's prolonged, if the conflict is prolonged, I think the bigger risk isn't even necessarily an immediate collapse, but maybe a slower deterioration as we get those second order impacts from energy costs, inflation, weaker consumer confidence, and as those work their way into business performance and marketing budgets. So potentially even larger hit to next year than this year, slower recovery. US hosted Olympics in 28 is going to be a pretty big boost regardless. So that's kind of our thinking from the overall analysis we did. And just looking at, again, those differences between whether you're a consumer packaged goods or sort of essentials, consumer essentials company, particularly targeting those lower and middle income consumers who are going to be both, highest squeezed by oil prices, probably most impacted by increased inflation overall and interest rates. Those are a bit of a different position than, say, luxury advertisers in tech and AI sectors, financial services they're holding up a bit better, even amongst this volatility. In the other markets in EMEA, anything you think is giving a signal as to how this is going to play out in the markets you cover there?
Yeah, I think in some markets, like such as Spain, Italy, we are seeing that inflation tick up. And what that means in terms of consumer spend going forward, we will definitely, go into this area. If this lasts longer than expected, then, that more cautious sentiment, which could have an impact on like how brands kind of target these price conscious consumers, especially in certain sectors such as retail, for example. But I think generally it doesn't it doesn't at the base of facts appear that this is something similar to what we've seen in the Russia-Ukraine crisis back in 2022. Inflation still is at a lower level, and it becomes important for brands to think about where there's a lot of uncertainty. They have become a lot more flexible in their ability to pivot these times as well. And that's where, brand messaging becomes quite important, right? Especially for some of these sectors you mentioned, and the resilience we're seeing there.
We wrote about the the Middle East too, sorry, and how we anticipate that that's really a momentary setback rather than a sort of systemic risk or structural shift. Is the anticipation is that especially government investment is going to come back, and that's something that you've spent a time looking at is how much of that market is helped by wealth funds or government investment in those markets.
Absolutely. And, Middle East, obviously a different kind of scenario because, it's local and the impacts are happening with, people working from home. Also the tourism industry as well, right? We've seen robust travel last year and the sector really doing good in terms of revenue growth and ad spending as well. Now, what that means, particularly for this region, there's a lot of disruption happening at the moment, and the possible implications, especially as fuel prices rise and people's ability to spend on the sector do remain, an area of focus. Yeah, I think definitely in terms of out of home, I think will particularly be impacted for the Middle East, particularly as you see these signs of more work from home, more tourism being impacted, and some of these factors really coming to play.
Yeah, some of the things we talk about in the analysis is again, what does it mean for brands? That's how we start every episode. So if we take a closer look at that, things like scenario planning. There's a reason why this document was written with sort of three potential scenarios: is having a plan in place around, you know, faster resolution versus long, protracted, drawn out sort of conflict. Second is really recognizing that bifurcation. Not all consumers or categories are going to experience this equally. Third, I think don't confuse a political headline with real recovery. There's a lot in what the research we did around even if someone waved a magic wand and it was quote unquote over, next week, it takes a long time to potentially clear mines and repair infrastructure that's been damaged and, get back the barrels of oil that, where production was stopped for so long. And if we miss certain timelines again for things like planting and fertilizer, those have long-term impacts, not just something that can be turned on and off, which I think in our digital world, a lot of us just assume everything is instantaneous. But in real world physical manufacturing and supply chains, it doesn't quite work that way. Watching those logistics, insurance, like the cost to insure ships really, that's gone up astoundingly. You just don't always think about these sort of issues that exist in the world in your sort of bubble of day-to-day life. And then the last thing, I think, and Nidhi, you were sort of talking to this too, is not letting uncertainty create paralysis, right? The competitive market is still moving. AI native brands are coming in. You have cross-border entrants. Structurally advantaged sectors are not standing still. So is working with the best information you can. And hopefully that's why we're here, is to help provide as much of that as we can. But I think, ultimately inaction in this case does have a cost as well. So short version, global advertising looks sturdier than the broader macro picture might imply, but that strength is uneven and brands that plan too narrowly could get a bit caught out. Jeff, final thoughts, one indicator you'd sort of watch closely over over the next few months?
Yeah, I think, you kind of touched on it. I think the big key in this is, just sort of looking at some of those maybe hidden indicators that we don't discuss or we think about a lot. Like you said, the shipping insurance is a big one. Of course, energy gets a lot of headlines, but you kind of, when you look at sort of like the secondary part of energy, transportation costs, shipping costs, those sort of things, and then how that will impact, affordability, inflation across the global, and then how that, of course, trickles into marketing and advertising. So I think those are the ones that, definitely keeping an eye on. Kind of going back to, the travel industry, which is a little bit more of the tip of the spear of seeing the energy impacts. We're already seeing commentary from some travel CEOs about surcharges, increasing in fuel costs, which could impact demand
Well, and the
for
route
leisure
interruptions,
travel.
right? Because Etihad and Emirates and all those companies had become really big hubs for transit everywhere else, basically.
Exactly. So I think, another interesting thing is just this, since they're sort of seeing this first, to kind of keep an eye on those sectors that are more vulnerable to this type of energy shock. I think that's going to, might be, could provide an interesting
Yeah.
signal and indication of where we're heading.
Well, moving on, two landmark verdicts this week are opening up a new front in the debate about platform responsibility and what it means for the brands that spend on these platforms. This was, and being in the US and on the West Coast, there's been a lot of coverage of this. There were two jury trials that wrapped up at least their initial phases this week. So, I'll do a very brief kind of synopsis here, and then we'll get into a little bit of what this means for advertisers. A New Mexico jury ruled against Meta, finding it violated state consumer protection law over how it represented platform safety for children and how its platforms facilitated potential child exploitation risks. The jury awarded roughly $375 million in civil penalties in that case. And then I think there's another phase looking at addressing possible remedies there. In Los Angeles, this was Meta and YouTube case. Snap and TikTok were initially named but settled before the trial. The Los Angeles jury found Meta and YouTube liable in a case brought by a young woman who argued that their platforms were deliberately designed to be addictive and contributed to serious mental health harm. The jury in that case awarded about $6 million total in compensatory and punitive damages, with Meta assigned the larger share of responsibility. Now, that case is what's known as a bellwether, and there are numerous other cases that will use the same or a similar tactic rather than going after the content itself, which is broadly protected by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. We do have statements from both companies, from a Meta spokesperson, quote, "We respectfully disagree with the verdict and are evaluating our legal options." And from a Google spokesperson, quote, "We disagree with the verdict and plan to appeal. This case misunderstands YouTube, which is a responsibly built streaming platform, not a social media site." Back to our podcast. Longtime followers of our work on this podcast will know that this is something we've been tracking for a long time as a potential important dynamic in the industry. We talked about some of these potential cases and lines of argument, probably back in 2024 in our This Year, Next Year report. Now, the decision here, again, it's going to be challenged by these companies, so we haven't seen the end of this. And like I said, there are a number of other cases that are going to follow this, being brought by state attorneys general and school districts and the like. So lots still to come on how this plays out. Naturally, the decision has unleashed a lot of commentary about the role of advertisers in this mix. I think one of the things that many fail to appreciate, especially when they call out large brand name advertisers, how small of a portion of Meta's revenue those advertisers are, that for the most part, that revenue is being driven by small, medium-sized businesses and direct advertisers, and that past even boycotts around 2020, 2021, didn't impact enough of the revenue to always produce the results that large brand advertisers had been looking for. So we've seen a lot of these discussions before, and we anticipate those conversations to continue. I think one of the things that we constantly will talk about is how much good quality journalism also depends on advertising and how much we look at funding that. I think in the next segment, we're going to talk about a couple segments, talk about US and newspaper revenue, digital newspaper revenue, and how well that did last year. In a time of really clear volatility and uncertainty, there are always alternatives for advertisers to place their marketing budgets. And then ultimately, it's up to every individual client and every individual consumer as to their values, their risk tolerance, where they want to put their energy, time, money, and budgets. Personally, I deleted my Meta, Facebook and Instagram accounts 10 years ago. Never downloaded or signed up for TikTok. It's a personal choice. So I think everyone can make those. And we certainly look to help our clients make their own decisions about everything that they're investing in broadly, right, across every type of publisher and channel. So it'll be interesting to see and track how this plays out in the months ahead, especially in the new context of AI. And many of these platforms are also involved in that expanding channel as well. So let's switch to Netflix. Let's go there. Jeff, why don't you give us an overview of some of the news, and then we can talk about baseball as well.
Yeah, so big week for Netflix, especially here in the U.S. We had Netflix doing the MLB home opener, the Yankees versus the Giants up in San Francisco. And then also news of yet Netflix raising U.S. prices once again. So they raised prices at the beginning of last year. So this is the second increase in a little over a year for them.
Yeah, I think so. You can taking price as a sign or a signal by streamers that they believe they have pricing power and the majority of their subscribers will absorb the monthly cost. So maybe for advertisers, that's a proxy for engagement stickiness, or maybe it's just a realization, Jeff, that the cost of sports production is real.
Yeah, I think that's where I was going to head. I think, especially seeing how they, will not be acquiring Warner Brothers Discovery and maybe pivoting a little bit more into live sports, especially in the US, and knowing that live sports is not a cheap endeavor by any means. I can see where this could definitely help boost your cash reserves for for going after any particular packages. For example, an NFL international package,
Yeah.
which is rumored to be on the table, and a World Cup is actually up for bidding after this current cycle in the U.S. after Fox has it.
Yeah.
So there's some big sports properties out there.
Did you watch the broadcast?
Yeah, I did watch the game. It was really interesting. The picture quality, I noticed that it almost had a washed out kind of tint
Yeah.
to it. Almost looked like fireworks had went off or something. I thought maybe that's what was going on, but by a few innings later, it hadn't cleared up. So maybe just a little technical glitches or issues or
Yeah, I
bugs to
noticed the
being
same
worked out.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think my kids were most intrigued by the fact that they had New York taxi cabs and cable cars on the field,
Yeah.
which I think speaks to the sort of level of production value, I guess they were going for. They can sort out, like you said, hopefully the picture quality. I do think that will be a miss ongoing for viewers, but hopefully I think it's just a one-time thing.
Yeah, I think so too. They have plenty of time to work out all the technical bugs, but it was interesting just to see their take on, baseball and kind of giving it the Netflix spin, I guess, so to speak, with everything from the announcers to, like you said, the taxi cabs, the cable cars, the graphics.
I have to say, the one thing that really gave me like agita was having a mic'd player like commentating during the inning.
Oh,
I was like,
yeah.
"What?" They had Jazz Chisholm, I think is
Jazz
his name,
Chisholm, yes.
and I was like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah.
I would never let my player be distracted
Right.
by, like, talking to the commentators in the
Yeah.
middle of the inning. He's in the
Taking
outfield,
taking
like,
concentration off.
oh my
Yeah. Now
gosh.
the question is, does this lead to viral moments that, then get shared on social media? Is that part of the plan, or is that
I don't know. I'd be so nervous as his PR rep.
right.
I mean, maybe, but that just struck me as I had a really hard time focusing because I was watching the pitching and I worried he
Yeah.
was gonna miss a line
Yeah.
drive or something. I don't know.
Get
Anyway,
distracted. Yeah. Yeah, it was very interesting to see that on the production. I can't imagine if there's ever a postseason game that happening, but we'll see.
So I have been informed by our producer, Gia, as we're talking about live events, that the BTS concert was a huge success. Netflix's other foray into live entertainment apparently racked up over 18 million viewers. What else? She has some stats for us. The broadcast from Seoul's historic square, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that, I'm sorry, reached the top 10 in 80 countries and secured the number one spot in 24 countries, and has reached over 2.6 billion social impressions. So I think they're in it to stay. They're experimenting with a lot of different places, but certainly sports and music are going to have a place in that.
100%. It's a pretty tried and true tested playbook of sports live events. It was interesting just thinking back to Univision's earnings where they did mention live music also getting great ratings, a lot of, popular shows and concerts. So I think we might start seeing a little bit more of that, and whether it bleeds into legacy media as well and seeing more, live concerts broadcasts, or this something the streamers start competing in more. I think that makes a lot of sense. And, we've seen it especially on the legacy media side for advertisers, just how, these are probably one of the last few things, type of live communal shared experiences that really attract mass audiences. So
Yeah.
you can see what the strategy is. It's pretty clear.
Yeah. So while Netflix is betting on big, expensive live moments across the content landscape, we're also seeing things in the opposite direction, which is very short, very cheap, very mobile first, micro dramas. We've talked about it on the show before. We've been tracking it for a very long time because we've been tracking China, and that's obviously where they sort of came to rise in popularity first. Now they're definitely having their sort of international growth moment. They've been written about in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times for the last couple of years. And Nidhi, I know you've been tracking sort of who's getting into the mix in the European region, especially.
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting to see how, the content landscape is really reshaping. It's not, I mean, you've got sports, you've got long form content, you've got short form content, and part of that short form content is now micro dramas as well, and typical episodes being about, less than 3 minutes or really short in short. I think in EMEA, it's just been interesting to hear more kind of coverage in this space, particularly as, we're hearing some European media owners, studios, and production companies as well, already planning to already investing within the space to really target those more mobile first and younger audiences. Examples being Atlas Media, Banijay Entertainment, even in Sweden, we've got Swedish broadcasters who are also looking into invest and doing more.
I mean,
Um,
can you really get like a Nordic noir though in 3 minutes? I feel like you need just 3 minutes to set the sort of dark Danish or Swedish landscape.
yeah, I know, and I think that's one of
I'm teasing, but
I think one of the challenges, particularly I think from a broadcaster perspective, if you're re-editing the longer form content into something that's chunk size, how do you tell that like story in that short space? I think that's definitely a challenge. But I think the real draw for some media companies, especially for this, it's cost effective as well as you can have multiple revenue streams. So from advertising, subscriptions, and pay-per-view. And with really AI entering the space, there's also the likelihood that production costs become even cheaper, but it does also at the same time increase competition for European players. I guess local relevance and the local culture and how that's embedded within the microdramas could be a key differentiator versus some of the global platforms.
yeah, because a lot of those global platforms are, I think, showing a lot of Chinese dramas. That's just what exists, right? In terms of the library right now. I think one thing you said that I wanted to pick up on was this re-editing existing content. And it takes me back to sort of early days of advertising on social when one of the biggest criticisms was don't just try and cut down your TV ad to work on social because it's an entire channel and platform. You need to make social first sort of assets, right, as a brand. And so I think we're gonna, I would assume, very quickly get to the same realization here: is this is not just a repackage your existing sitcom or whatever. It really needs to be high drama, fast moments, cliffhangers designed for this medium. So yeah, I can definitely, it still might be cheaper and more cost effective. Ultimately, you're producing shorter forms of content, but I don't think re-editing is gonna cut it. And then the other thing you said, pay-per-view, if anyone's seeing big splashy revenue numbers for microdramas already, most of that is really, by the next episode. There's not a lot of these, especially outside of China, like ad revenue against this yet. Obviously, that's why we're watching it. But a lot of that so far is the sort of in-app paid purchases so far that we're seeing. So just a note to keep that in mind if you're seeing news stories and things being sent around about that.
Yeah, because it's always interesting to think of like a commercial and ad load on a 2 or 3 minute long short form content, which is already short by its very nature. So,
Well, one of the other things, they're doing branded
right,
content. So
branded
this is
content. Yeah.
Televisa Univision, actually. We've already mentioned
Yep.
them this episode, but creating branded microdramas. I think I saw they did one with JCPenney, maybe. Google working with 100 Zeros, as is Keenan Thompson's production company. So I think, that's another potential, right? More of a sponsored tactic. I will say there's some early data from Sensor Tower, even in the US, talked about China, EMEA, and the US, while well behind vertical video like YouTube, TikTok, and Reels. There's some evidence that microdrama apps are accounting for potentially more time spent on mobile devices than, say, a Disney or some of those other streaming apps. So we'll see, but it's at least a great segue into talking about the US market writ large. So let's quickly just kind of finish on the key stats we saw as we rounded out our 2025 revenue. And then looking into 2026.
Yeah. So when we just finished up our 2025 look, we saw 14.7% increase in the U.S. market, which is it's just astounding, especially with all the uncertainty. Then when looking ahead to 2026, we're looking at a 7.4% year-over-year growth, which again, coming off the back of a 14.7% is it's pretty remarkable. Again, it just shows the resilience, and of course, probably not a huge surprise, but digital advertising and leading the way with a 15.6% increase in 2025. And I think the other interesting thing that we saw in our data was that newspapers, as we kind of were talking about earlier, really, really resilient and a bright spot at 10.4% growth in 2025. Now, of course, a lot of that is coming on the digital side, where I think digital we're estimating is almost 90% of all of newspaper advertising. But I think it just goes to show, like, in this kind of heightened crazy frenetic news cycle that trusted large nationally known sources are remain quite popular and they have audiences.
Yeah, for sure. Spend with your local or national newspaper. That's the message.
Exactly. And then I think, just, looking ahead to 2026, I think it's going to be a very interesting story in the U.S., with the midterm election cycles. So I think we're going to kind of see, the bifurcation of the tale of two type of TVs, where we have national TV growing 1.9% and local, excluding political, would be down 11%, which I think, you can see the impact of crowd out on political advertising. So I think it's going to be a very interesting dynamic just to see that, local is becoming more and more propped up by political advertising, local elections, as far as crowd out goes as well.
Yeah. I mean, it feels it's like risky just in that you're so
Yeah, dependent.
spiky
Yeah.
and I mean dependent, but which political money will go there. I think we keep seeing more and more political money, so there's probably enough to continue going around. But if you're a local business and you sort of historically have money in TV and you find it really, hard to get the spots you need or to advertise in political years, maybe you just start shifting that more and more to CTV or fast or out of home or I don't know, whatever else, right? Where you're not experiencing the same kind of
Right.
volatility year to year in terms of your TV purchases. I don't know. I
Yeah,
don't
your
have
TV.
any anecdotal evidence for that. Just
Yeah, exactly. Like, because you're competing with the political dollars, which are driving up prices. So does it make you start looking at, CTV type of options or other, more local-ish type of options, like you said, like out of home, which we actually, think should have a pretty solid year in 2026 in the US, especially behind the World Cup.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
that's another interesting area where, maybe advertisers could, maybe need to start reexamining that a little bit closer, especially at the local level.
Yep. All right. Well, I think that wraps us up for this week. Anything folks are watching next week, literally or figuratively, I suppose?
We've got March Madness. We have Duke St. John's today, which is exciting. And then, of course, the start of the baseball season.
Yes, baseball for sure. I have to admit, I've not followed very much of March Madness this year. Normally, I do. Normally, I fill out a bracket. Didn't do it this year. UCLA is already out. So.
Yeah. You
you
could have
know,
had AI fill out your bracket now.
apparently that was quite successful as a tactic. We may get the SpaceX IPO next week. That would be interesting. I mean, it would be fascinating if we were to get any more actual financial data on X, for instance, which SpaceX now owns XAI and X. It's like a roundabout way to getting financial disclosures from that media platform again. Yeah, so we'll see there. We'll see if there are more LinkedIn and X battles over the justification of paid media. We didn't get into this, but I found that interesting from the sidelines this week about I think some maybe the misconception in some venture capital circles that a product alone is enough to kind of reach mass scale. You can go look this up, listeners, if you want to afterwards. But there was a groundswell of people from the media and marketing community who sort of leapt in and said, no, that growth was driven by paid advertising. I worked in that company. We bought the ads. And that's certainly what we've been saying for the last, however many years, especially of that sort of digital cohort that was named, companies like Uber and Airbnb and TikTok that all spent, very sizable shares of revenue on media and marketing during that time to grow revenue and user bases. So it was nice to see our community coming together in that way. We'll catch up on all of that next week. In the meantime, thank you for listening to the WPP Media Intelligence podcast. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you have any questions for the show, you can email us at business.intelligence@wppmedia. As a reminder, the Media Intelligence podcast from WPP Media is meant for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered financial advice.